Right now, there's an entire genre of videos online claiming an artificial intelligence named Grok has finally solved the mystery of the Great Pyramid. Some say it revealed the pyramid was secretly a machine, tuned to Earth's own electromagnetic frequency. Its granite chambers packed with piezoelectric quartz generating hidden power. Others say it uncovered undeniable proof of who really built it, hinting at something other than ordinary human beings. Others simply say Grok analyzed thousands of years of evidence and reached a conclusion so disturbing, researchers didn't know what to do with it. One video claims the AI cross-referenced engineering data, geological surveys, and astronomical alignments, and arrived at results that left experts speechless. Another claims it examined the exact composition of the pyramid's limestone and granite, and detected subtle conductive and piezoelectric properties, supposedly proving the structure was engineered as some kind of resonance device rather than a tomb. Different channels, different thumbnails, the exact same structure every time. And if you actually try to find the source, the real transcript, the real research team, the real institution that ran this supposed analysis, you find absolutely nothing. No paper, no named scientist, no verifiable session with any AI system at all. It's invented. The same fabricated formula recycled again and again, because a machine solving an ancient mystery makes for a more dramatic thumbnail than the truth. And here's what's genuinely frustrating about that, because the actual real answer to who built the Great Pyramid and how doesn't need a fake AI to make it compelling. It's already one of the most remarkable archaeological detective stories of the last 20 years, built entirely on real excavated evidence, a 4,500-year-old diary, written by a real man, found in a cave by the Red Sea, describing his actual working days hauling stone toward Giza, alongside an entire buried town, bakeries, barracks, and cattle bones that archaeologists spent decades digging out of the sand right next to the pyramids themselves. That's not a machine's conclusion. That's real, physical, verifiable proof. And it already overturned one of the oldest myths about the pyramids on its own. No artificial intelligence required. For most of modern history, the popular image of how the pyramids were built came largely from a single ancient source. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid was actually completed, who described a story of 100,000 suffering, exploited laborers, whipped into decades of forced service under a cruel pharaoh Khufu. That image, endlessly recycled through Hollywood films and popular imagination ever since, gave the pyramids their most enduring myth, monuments built on the backs of slaves. The problem is, Herodotus was writing millennia after the fact, based on secondhand stories and Egyptian guides eager to entertain a curious Greek tourist, not based on any direct evidence from Khufu's own era. Herodotus himself, to his credit, was fairly upfront in his own writing about the fact that he was relaying stories told to him by local guides and priests, rather than claiming to have witnessed any of it directly, a detail modern retellings tend to conveniently drop whenever the slave narrative gets recycled for dramatic effect. For most of the 20th century, without much physical evidence either way, that dramatic secondhand story simply filled the gap, repeated so consistently across textbooks, documentaries, and popular fiction, that it hardened into something resembling settled fact, despite never actually being confirmed by anyone who lived through the period it claimed to describe. Then starting in the late 1980s, and dramatically accelerating over the past 2 decades, actual archaeological excavation began replacing that secondhand Greek story with real, physical evidence, dug directly out of the ground at Giza itself. And what it revealed was almost the exact opposite of the slave narrative. Archaeologist Mark Lehner began a full-scale excavation of a site called Hayt el Ghurab, located just a few hundred yards from the pyramids and the Sphinx, a location that had sat largely unexamined for decades, despite its proximity to one of the most studied archaeological sites on Earth. What Lehner's team found over more than 30 years of careful, ongoing excavation was an entire residential settlement believed to have housed the workers who built the pyramids of pharaohs Khafra and Menkaure, constructed just a decade or so after Khufu's own death. This wasn't a prison camp. It was a functioning town, complete with barracks-style housing and, remarkably, dozens of dedicated bakeries clustered around the residential quarters. The sheer scale of that bread production alone tells you something important, since feeding a workforce large enough to require dozens of separate bakery installations implies an organized, centrally managed food supply chain, not the kind of ad hoc, minimal subsistence you'd expect if the laborers were considered disposable. Alongside those bakeries, Lehner's team recovered an enormous quantity of animal bones, evidence that the people living there were eating meat on a regular, apparently daily basis. An extraordinary level of dietary provision that Lehner himself has pointed out was not typical for ordinary laborers anywhere else in the ancient Middle East during this period. According to Lehner, the evidence suggests these workers were being deliberately fed large amounts of protein and carbohydrates, the kind of sustained, structured nutrition you provide to a valued workforce you need functioning at full physical capacity for years at a time, not a workforce you consider expendable or disposable. Lehner's excavation also uncovered evidence suggesting the settlement included dedicated administrative buildings, areas that appear to have functioned as a kind of central bakery and food redistribution hub, and deeper, still only partially explored layers that may date back specifically to Khufu's own reign, meaning archaeologists suspect there's even more direct evidence about the Great Pyramid's own specific workforce still waiting to be uncovered at this exact site, using nothing more exotic than careful, patient, traditional excavation. That discovery alone was enough to seriously challenge the old slave labor narrative. But the far more dramatic confirmation came from an entirely different location, 150 miles away from Giza, at a quiet, remote harbor on the Red Sea coast called Wadi al-Jarf, a site so obscure and so far removed from typical tourist routes that it had escaped serious archaeological attention and looting for most of the 20th century. In 2013, a joint French and Egyptian archaeological team, led by Egyptologist Pierre Tallet, working at Wadi al-Jarf, made a discovery that genuinely stunned the field. A cache of papyrus fragments hidden away inside man-made limestone caves that turned out to be the oldest written papyri ever recovered anywhere in Egypt, dating back roughly 4,600 years, to the actual 27th year of Pharaoh Khufu's own reign, the exact era when the Great Pyramid itself was under active construction. Tallet's excavations had already, over several prior seasons, identified Wadi al-Jarf as the oldest known constructed harbor anywhere in the world, a sprawling operation supporting mining expeditions across the Red Sea into the Sinai Peninsula, where Egyptian crews traveled specifically to extract copper, the metal used to forge the very tools required to cut and shape the pyramid's limestone blocks in the first place. The harbor itself included a series of long man-made storage galleries carved directly into the limestone hillside, originally used to store dismantled boats and equipment between expeditions, sealed shut with massive stone blocking slabs whenever the harbor went dormant between voyages. It was inside one of these sealed storage galleries, protected for millennia by the region's extremely dry desert conditions, that Tallet's team found the papyri. And this has since become known, somewhat poetically, as the discovery of the Red Sea Scrolls. And among them was something no archaeologist had ever previously possessed, an actual, contemporaneous, day-by-day work diary, written by a real man who had genuinely participated in building the Great Pyramid, describing his own working life in his own words, in real time as it happened. The diary belonged to a middle-ranking official named Merer, an inspector who led a working crew of roughly 200 men. Merer's team weren't stonecutters swinging chisels at the pyramid face itself. They were boatmen and haulers, responsible for transporting massive blocks of high-quality limestone from quarries at a site called Tura, on the opposite side of the Nile, down to the construction site at Giza, a journey covering somewhere between 15 and 20 kilometers, depending on the specific route and water levels at the time. Merer's entries read almost exactly like a modern work log or timesheet, plain, methodical, entirely unglamorous. A typical entry describes him spending the day with his crew, called a philo, hauling stones at Tura South or loading stones onto boats at Tura North in preparation for the river crossing over to Giza. According to researchers who have studied the documents closely, the papyri are laid out in a structure genuinely comparable to a modern spreadsheet, tracking exactly what materials were needed, what had already been delivered, and what remained outstanding, the same basic administrative logic any modern supply chain manager would immediately recognize. There's something worth pausing on here in just how mundane and bureaucratic these entries actually are, because that mundanity is itself the strongest possible evidence against the old slave narrative. A civilization brutally exploiting a captive workforce with no investment in the outcome has little practical reason to maintain this kind of granular, ongoing administrative record, tracking specific crew rotations, specific delivery quantities, specific dates and locations day after day for years on end. That level of bureaucratic precision is exactly what you'd expect from a well-organized, professionally managed logistics operation. One where workers, schedules, and materials all needed to be tracked and coordinated because the operation itself depended on their reliable, sustained cooperation rather than raw coercion. Alongside Merer's daily journal, the same cache included separate account books tracking something equally revealing: the movement of bread, beer, cereal grains, and meat. Supplies feeding what researchers estimate was a workforce of around 20,000 people, spread across the quarries, the transport routes, and the construction site itself. Bread and beer, in particular, functioned as standard wage payments in ancient Egyptian society, meaning these documents effectively function as ancient payroll records, tracking compensation distributed to a working, provisioned labor force, not rations doled out to enslaved captives with no stake in the outcome of their own labor. Tallet and his colleagues have been direct about what this discovery actually demonstrates. Rather than deepening the mystery, the diary of Merer transforms the pyramids from an unexplained enigma into something closer to a fully documented, functioning logistics operation, one involving stone deliveries, boat schedules, and rotating shift work, organized with a level of bureaucratic precision that only makes sense within a coordinated state-run labor system, not a slave camp improvised through raw brutality. The men in Merer's crew weren't nameless, faceless captives. They had a specific unit name, recorded directly in the papyri. The escort team of the Urius of Khufu is its prow, a title referencing the specific ship they operated, suggesting these were, in Talit's own words, essentially sailors, skilled maritime specialists assigned to a demanding, technically complex logistics role within a much larger, coordinated national project. Researchers have also pointed out that the papyri appear to have been deliberately, carefully archived, rather than simply discarded, with Talit suggesting the crew likely sealed up their own records inside the storage galleries around the time of Khufu's death, perhaps as operations at the harbor wound down following the end of his reign, preserving, entirely by accident of careful ancient bookkeeping, a window into pyramid construction that modern archaeologists would only rediscover 46 centuries later. And the story didn't stop unfolding with Talit's 2013 discovery. As recently as 2025, Zahi Hawass released new details from an ongoing inspection campaign examining inscriptions located directly above the king's chamber, inside the Great Pyramid itself, deep within a series of small, relieving chambers built specifically to redistribute the enormous structural weight bearing down on the burial chamber below, an engineering solution ancient builders devised specifically to prevent the massive stone ceiling from eventually cracking under the sheer tonnage of rock stacked above it. Those relieving chambers themselves have been known to Egyptologists since the early 19th century, but detailed modern inspection of the actual markings inside them has continued to yield new information right up through the present. Those inscriptions, written in red ochre pigment directly onto the stone blocks by the workers who placed them nearly 4,600 years ago, record the names of rotating work gangs alongside tallies logging the actual number of days each crew worked, an internal practical record-keeping system that closely echoes the exact same kind of logistics documented independently, over 100 miles away, in Merer's own diary at Wadi el-Jarf. According to Hawass, this new evidence adds further weight to the conclusion that the pyramid was raised by paid, seasonal crews housed in dedicated worker villages near the construction site, rotating through structured shifts, rather than by a single, permanently enslaved population forced into indefinite, uncompensated labor. Hawass discussed this material directly in a June 2025 interview on the Matt Beal Limitless podcast, walking through exactly how these red ochre gang markings corroborate findings from an entirely separate excavation site discovered more than a decade earlier and over 100 miles away, two completely independent lines of physical evidence, arrived at through two entirely separate research efforts, converging on the exact same conclusion about who actually built this monument and how they were organized and compensated for doing it. That same 2025 inspection campaign also happened to touch on a separate, genuinely significant scientific discovery, one that connects directly back to the actual verified engineering mysteries still being resolved at Giza using real technology, rather than any invented AI narrative. Back in 2017, the Scan Pyramids Research Project, using muon radiography, cosmic ray-based imaging capable of detecting hidden voids inside solid stone, identified a previously unknown cavity inside the Great Pyramid, nicknamed the Big Void, measuring at least 30 meters in length, using 3 separate, independently operated detection systems for cross-verification. In this more recent 2025 campaign, researchers finally inserted a small snake camera directly into that same void, specifically searching for additional inscriptions or possible construction ramps that might explain exactly how workers maneuvered materials into position at that particular stage of construction. According to Hawass, while full laboratory analysis of the footage was still pending, the preliminary images showed what he described as ordinary quarry marks, nothing supernatural, a plainly stated, refreshingly undramatic update on one of the pyramid's last remaining unexplored spaces, delivered by an actual named Egyptologist, using an actual camera, rather than any invented chatbot narrative. It's worth sitting with just how much quieter and how much more procedurally careful that actual update was compared to the manufactured drama surrounding every fake AI pyramid video currently circulating. Hawass didn't claim the footage proved some hidden ancient power source or evidence of a lost civilization, or anything remotely resembling the breathless claims attached to invented Grok analysis videos. He described plain, ordinary quarry marks, the kind of practical, workmanlike evidence entirely consistent with everything Lehner's excavation and Talit's papyri had already independently established. And he was careful to note that formal laboratory analysis was still pending before any firmer conclusions could be drawn. That kind of careful provisional language, willing to say we don't have the final answer yet, is precisely the marker of genuine, functioning scientific process. And it's exactly the kind of nuance that gets stripped out entirely whenever this same underlying research gets flattened into a shocking, definitive-sounding fake headline. This is genuinely what real scientific progress on an ancient mystery looks like, and it's worth sitting with the contrast directly. It's slow. It happens across multiple excavation sites, sometimes 150 miles apart from each other over multiple decades, requiring independent teams working separately to each turn up physical evidence that happens to reinforce what the other team already found. It involves real named researchers, Mark Lanner at Hayt El Ghurab, Pierre Talat at Wadi Al Jarf, Zahi Hawass, working directly inside the pyramid's internal chambers, each publishing their findings, subjecting their conclusions to scrutiny from other qualified Egyptologists, building a case using worker housing, ration records, shift tracking inscriptions, and a genuine 4,600-year-old diary written by a man who was actually there. None of that requires an artificial intelligence to package it into a satisfying conclusion. None of it needs to be reframed as some hidden, disturbing truth mainstream science supposedly doesn't want you to know. The actual documented history of who built the Great Pyramid is already dramatic enough entirely on its own terms. Not slaves, not aliens, not some ancient population possessing lost, secret technology, but a highly organized, surprisingly well-fed, seasonally rotating national workforce, managed with bureaucratic precision through supply logs, shift rotations, and wage payments in bread and beer, coordinated across a network of quarries, harbors, and worker villages, stretching from the Nile all the way out to the Red Sea coast. It's a genuinely remarkable achievement of ancient logistics and large-scale human organization, one so impressive that Egyptologists are still actively uncovering new physical evidence confirming it, as recently as the year we're in right now. There's a broader lesson buried in all of this, one that applies well beyond just this one monument. The real history of the Great Pyramid didn't get uncovered by a single dramatic revelation, a single AI query, or a single press conference. It got uncovered slowly, painstakingly, through decades of careful excavation, through archives found by accident in a sealed cave 150 miles from the site they described, through patient comparison of independent findings that happened to converge from entirely different directions. That's simply how genuine historical knowledge actually gets built, brick by brick, much like the monument itself, rather than delivered all at once in a single tidy, algorithmically generated conclusion. So the next time you see a video claiming Grok, or any artificial intelligence, has finally reached some shocking, disturbing conclusion about who really built the pyramids, ask yourself the same question worth asking about every one of these fabricated headlines. Where's the actual transcript, the actual research team, the actual verifiable event behind the claim? In the real story of the pyramid builders, you don't have to ask that question because the actual answer already exists, sitting in museum display cases in Cairo, painstakingly reconstructed from fragile papyrus fragments, and excavated bakery ovens written by real people 46 centuries ago in their own hand, describing their own ordinary working lives. That's not a machine's conclusion. That's history finally allowed to speak for itself.